Hello, and welcome to the What Exploring Old English podcast. I'm Nat.
And I'm Marco. Today on the podcast, we have the absolute pleasure to speak with Thomas Shippey. How do I put this? Dr. Thomas Shippey of the UK is kind of like Robert Folk of the US, the pinnacle of Old English, medievalism, and philology scholarship. In addition to teaching at many prestigious universities and pioneering Old English research, he's a leading expert in all things JRR Tolkien, having published the bestsellers Road to Middle-earth and JRR Tolkien, Author of the Century.
Today's talk will take us all the way through Shippey's life, starting with his youth as a boy in Calcutta and Scotland, and progressing through the rungs of higher education and England's network of Old English scholarship.
By the way, this conversation will take more of a narrative style. So without further ado, let us commence the journey of the lionized Dr. Thomas Shippey, right from the beginning.
What was my timeline? Okay, it's quite easy, but at the start it may seem irrelevant, but I don't think it is. I was born in India. My father was a civil engineer, specialized in bridge building. My mother was the daughter of the harbour master of Calcutta. At the age of 7, and this was the custom in those days, I was sent from India to a boarding school in Scotland. And I may say, I often do, it wasn't a sissy school like Hogwarts, where they all went home for the holidays. Oh, no, no, no. We were there 365 days a year, no time off, and we saw our parents every 3 years because they only got long leave every 3 years, and then they got 6 months because the travel time was so long. They didn't have air flight in those days. So I was sent back to Scotland, and the real reason for this, they said it was for health, because it was an unhealthy climate and all that. It wasn't. It was to make certain we spoke English. And spoke English furthermore with an acceptable accent, not Indian English. So the first thing they did when they got a new intake at the school was to break us up. It was like a slave ship, really. They didn't want the Hindi speakers all clustered together because they just speak Hindi. They didn't want the Swahili speakers, same thing. So we were split up into dorms, different native languages, you might say, but every dorm had one monoglot Scot who couldn't speak anything except broad Scots. So after a bit, we all talked broad Scots. So that lasted some time. And in fact, if you were a phonologist, you would hear, I think, that my basilect, as they call it these days, is in fact Scottish. That didn't last too long because my father came home and got a job in England. And I started off at King Edward's, Birmingham, which is one of the top schools in the country, and furthermore, the one that Tolkien went to. So I was, for the first time, but not for the last, treading in Tolkien's footsteps. Well, at that point, something funny happened, I suppose, and there's a strong element of chance in what I'm going to say. I was at school. We had a form room. At the form room, there was a lot of bookcases at the back. There are piles of set books there. Okay, not very interesting to me, but there was also a single copy of Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Primer. What it was doing there, I don't know. I never found out. They didn't teach Anglo-Saxon at King Edward's. Maybe Tolkien left it there for all I know. Anyway, I picked this up, and since no one wanted it, I quietly appropriated it, and I worked my way through it. I worked through the grammar, I worked through the text. I found it all quite easy because, I was already pretty good at German. So that gave me a kind of interest in the subject. And then I made a mistake, or rather a mistake was made for me, because my English teacher, whom I much respected, had been to Queen's College, Cambridge, and he decided it would be a good idea for me to go to Queen's College, Cambridge. So I did, but this was a mistake, because Cambridge and Oxford are really quite different. Oxford had compulsory Old English, and it had a special philological course, and Cambridge did neither of those. And furthermore, I think I would say it viewed all kinds of language study with a certain contempt. In fact, it was a damn bad course. I really didn't get on with them at all. It took me a long time to figure out what the problem was, but actually, the whole English course at Cambridge was all about social class. We had to read things like the most boring book in the world, which was Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. Well, I don't know. You see, I was supposed to admire this lady because she had very good taste. Well, I couldn't care less about that. And we were also supposed to read D.H. Lawrence so that we could sympathize with the struggle of the workers. Well, I didn't sympathize with the struggle of the workers. In fact, I wasn't interested in the whole bloody thing. You might say that was because I was a member of the imperial class, and I didn't really care about lower middle class, upper middle class, what the hell. Well, anyway, I won't say any more about that, but we just didn't get on, shall we say. I should have gone to Oxford, but I didn't. However, as I staggered through the Cambridge English course, I got the faculty handbook out and I read it carefully, and I discovered that I could take a paper in Old English and drop one of the bummers, which I'd have had to do otherwise. So I went to my director of studies and said, excuse me, Dr. Holloway, I would like to do a paper in Old English. And he said, quick as a flash, you can't. I said, well, I think I can actually, because here's the handbook. So he looked at this for a bit, and then he said, well, you'll have to go and see Professor Whitelock. That was Dorothy Whitelock, author of The Audience of Beowulf. And she didn't want to see me either. She didn't want spotty undergraduates wasting her time, which could be spent on better things. But I produced my handbook again, and so I was taken on to do this Old English paper, one of very few. There were a few guys from the modern language course. I think there are only 2 from the English course. Anyway, I did the Old English course and was very pleased to do it. Though I may say that the teaching, as usual at Cambridge, was diabolical. It was awful. I hardly ever understood a word Professor Whitelock said, because she kept on ranting on about dead Germans who she disagreed with. And since she never actually spelled a name out, I didn't know who they were. It took me a long time to catch on to what she was talking about, a long, long time. Anyway, that was that. I graduated, and then I had a pretty bad time, actually. So it wasn't until 1965 that oh yes, the other thing that happened was that I toddled along to my director of studies near the end of my course and said, I'd like to put in for a graduate degree. And he said, I will not recommend you for that. I don't think you've got it in you. So I thought, yeah, okay, I get it. I'm not popular, am I? Well, so I slouched off and left. And I didn't actually do a graduate degree, but I got a very good undergraduate degree. And of course, I'd also drawn the attention of people like Professor Whitelock and Professor Clemmos. It was easy to draw their attention. It was only me and him there. So that was okay. In 1965, I started applying for jobs. And I turned up, strangely enough, for a kind of adjunct job at Birmingham University, which was right opposite the school where I'd been. And I wouldn't stand a chance in hell of getting a job in modern circumstances, no graduate degree. What had I been doing? I'd been working for Colgate-Palmolive. But then the chance arrived. One of the people on the interview board, I.A. Shapiro, distinguished Shakespearean scholar, he asked me what I'd been doing, and I said I'd been marketing Ajax. And he said, what is Ajax? I said, it's a scouring powder. And he said, what is it for? And I said something like, do you not perceive, sir, it is for the scouring of a jakes. Jakes is an old word for toilet. This was such a pedantic, old-fashioned, pompous thing to say that Shapiro thought, hey, this kid is good. He's pedantic and old-fashioned just like me. In fact, he's a pedant in training. So he was entirely on my side, and I got the job. Well, after that, my career tended to go in sevens. I did 7 years in Birmingham. during which I wrote my first book, which was Old English Verse. At the end of that, I got a big promotion to a fellowship at Oxford. And I may say they didn't recruit many people from red brick universities to Oxford. Again, because of the class business, I think. However, I think I was, again, chance favored me. I went for my interview at Oxford in my old car, my horrible old car, and it broke down on the way. And I had to get out and fix it. So I turned up at Oxford very nearly late, in a thoroughly bad temper, with my hands covered in oil and muck, and no time to wash either. So they ushered me into the interview room, and the president, Professor Southern, stretched his hand out to me, and I said, "Sorry, can't shake hands, covered in oil." What the hell? And then they gave me actually really rather a hard interview. It wasn't just the usual, and what do you think you would like to do in the future? They started asking me hard questions about everything on my CV, my vita. And since I was in such a foul temper, I answered them all with something like open contempt. I just batted everyone into the bleachers, as you would say, scowling round as I did so. So this obviously impressed them. They had, in fact, intended to give the job to an insider who was a junior research fellow at the same college, and he came in after me, and so I hear, completely blew up. He had a very bad interview, and even at Oxford, they couldn't quite bring themselves to make the wrong choice. So I got the job at Oxford, and I stayed there for 7 years. Then I went off and got the chair, Tolkien's old chair, at the University of Leeds. Oh, incidentally, while I was at Oxford, I actually met Tolkien because his successor, Norman Davies, said, "Yeah, come on, you better go and meet the old man." So we went off and we had dinner together at Merton College. So I met Tolkien at Oxford. And then I went on, as I say, to take the chair at Leeds that Tolkien held, and I was there 14 years. So I did 7 years in Birmingham, 7 years in Oxford, 14 years in Leeds. And then, well, frankly, if I'd stayed on, they wanted to make me an administrator. And I had no intention of becoming an administrator. So I bailed out and applied for the Walter J. Ong Chair at St. Louis University. St. Louis was really only a second-rank university, but I wasn't too bothered about that. I felt, one thing that was clear was they didn't want me to be an administrator, so that was okay. I really became a kind of advertiser. I used to tour the Midwest giving lectures and whatnot and telling people what a good place St. Louis was to do medieval studies, which it was by this time. So I think actually I had a bit of luck there too, because I was told later that the committee at St. Louis had been very impressed because they said, what had I been doing in America after the MLA conference at which I'd made a presentation? And I said, oh, yes, well, I went skiing in Colorado. And they obviously thought, hot stuff, this. Actually, I can't ski at all. My hostess said to me, she said she could still see blood in the snow where I had landed two weeks earlier. So I was doing my best, but it wasn't very good. But anyway, that somehow sort of oiled the wheels at St. Louis. And I was there for not quite 14 years, it was 15 years. And then I retired, and that was that was 16 years ago. So it was 7, 14, 15, 16. And that should total up to whatever my total is. I forget. Well, that's the timeline. And as I say, with a strong element in it of chance and luck, which I'm, of course, very grateful for. However, I'm not sure that actually tells us very much. Perhaps I should, well, there's a question of intersections. I missed out one thing. you know, there's a kind of parlor game these days where you have to say the three things that define you. Okay, well, one of those I shall keep to myself. One is that I am a leftover from a vanished administration, the imperial one, and invariably on the wrong side of history, you know. And the other is that I'm a science fiction fan. And that happened in 1957 when I was, tell a lie, it was 1958 when I was 14. And I got flu. I was in bed. I hadn't got anything to read. My mother went down to the little newspaper stand and she came back with a copy of Astounding Science Fiction. And I read this and I thought, that's it. That's what I like. I'm going to read this forever. And of course I have done. You can't see it because it's in another room, but I have a pretty big collection of science fiction magazines. And actually you can see right behind me the Astounding Science Fiction copies, which I bought long ago and which I still have. So I'm a science fiction fan. I'm also interested in Old English, and I ran into Tolkien. Now, Tolkien, of course, was not uninterested in science fiction, but he was a fantasy writer, and that was okay by me as well. I regarded them as branches of the same thing, actually. So that was another kind of coincidence which helped to form my career or timeline or whatever. And you notice, perhaps, and this goes back to being a member of a vanished administration, all these were pretty unpopular in literary circles. I think the reason my director of studies wouldn't recommend me for graduate work was he had visited me one day and I had foolishly forgotten to hide my copy of Astounding Science Fiction. And he looked at that and he obviously thought, God, how trivial is this? This guy is just not serious. So that was me on the blacklist straight away. And of course, Old English at Cambridge was, as I've said several times, was so unpopular, it was bloody hard to get anyone to teach you. So I seem to be on the wrong side of history in sort of every respect. Well, that has one advantage, which is you don't have a lot of competition. I was always rather surprised that my book, Old English Verse, needed to be written at all. I mean, what had all those guys at Oxford been doing? Why didn't they write a kind of introduction for students? But it just wasn't thought to be necessary. So I got a kind of a good start there. As for Tolkien, I think one of the questions Marco spelled out for me was, hang on, where is it? What drove me to write The Road to Middle-earth? I can remember that very clearly. I think it was in 1969 that, yeah, that's probably right, that I first opened my mouth on the subject of Tolkien. And there was a kind of adult education day on in Birmingham, and they decided to have a Tolkien day, which was a good idea. And they got somebody to talk about Tolkien and philosophy, and somebody to talk about Tolkien and psychology, and they got me to talk about Tolkien and philology. Well, the first two talks on psychology and philosophy were absolutely hopeless because the speakers weren't interested in Tolkien at all. They wanted to talk about philosophy or whatever the hell it was. So the audience was streaming out by the time I came on as the last speaker. And I told them all to sit back down again because I was going to talk about Tolkien this time. And this is what they needed to know. We'd had a lot of student trouble recently and I was used to growling at people. So they sat down again and I gave the talk on Tolkien and philology, and Tolkien's secretary was in the audience. He was supposed to come, but he'd been ill, and she asked for a copy of my script. And I gave it to her. You know, in those days, I had a top copy and a carbon, and I gave her the top copy and kept the carbon. And she gave it to Tolkien, who wrote me a very nice letter about it. So that made me think, okay, this is quite a sensible thing to do. And the next thing that happened, I think, was that I went to things were opening up a bit. I went to a fantasy conference in Dublin, and once again the talks were incredibly bad. They were awful. They were talking about fantasy and they didn't like it and they didn't know anything about it. And they said things about Tolkien. And I was sitting on the plane in the window seat coming back from Dublin, looking at the propellers in the old plane and thinking, blimey, old Tollers, who by this time had died, old Tollers would be really unhappy if he heard the kind of thing they're saying about him now. It's all complete nonsense. Dear me, dear me. Someone ought to put the record straight. And at that moment, I got a kind of hollow feeling inside because I thought, and who is that going to be? Yeah, there's not much choice here, is it? It's going to have to be me. So I started work on The Road to Middle-earth, but you will notice, perhaps, I did not publish it until I was securely entrenched as a full professor with my own chair at Leeds University, because writing about Tolkien back then was the kiss of death. Once again, you got a reputation for being not serious. And that's actually, in a way, it's been there all along, hasn't it? Even recently, there was an issue of, I think, modern fiction studies in America, and it was a Tolkien issue, and all the articles were about Tolkien, and they were all negative. They all said, oh, well, he's racist, he's sexist, he's I don't know what. And they couldn't see anything good about him at all. I thought, that's dumb. If you can't see why someone is the top-selling author in the world, then you are not much of a literary critic, are you? I don't know if he is the top-selling author, but he must be one of them. And furthermore, he is the one who made really significant changes to the whole publishing industry. And again, I would put it like this. Before Tolkien, there were two fantasy traditions. There was the English one, which was really sort of upper class, learned, people like E.R. Edison, and very expensive. I may say I couldn't afford to buy The Lord of the Rings when it came out, and some black-hearted fiend had removed Volume 2 from the local library, and I didn't even dare to start Volume 1 because if I got to Volume 2 and it wasn't there, so it all had to wait until I won a book prize. But at that time, the 3 volumes of Lord of the Rings would have cost you 63 shillings. And that would be, in my private calculation, which is based on the price of beer, that would be something like 55 pints. And 55 pints in modern money would cost me 220 quid. Or if you prefer, what's that? Getting on for $300, which I hadn't got. But that was the English tradition. But there's also an American tradition, which is based on pulp magazines like Weird Tales and science fantasy. And this involved, and of course, this was not expensive. They came out, they were 25 cents a copy. Of course, you didn't get them in England very much, but you could get them sometimes. And so I was aware of the cheap American tradition, the pulp tradition, and the posh English tradition, and Tolkien combined them. He made fantasy for the first time mass market, very much mass market. Quite a long time ago, I was putting some ideas to a publisher, and I said something like, look, if you had a historical novel and a science fiction novel and a fantasy novel, and they all seemed about the same quality, which would you go for? And he said, fantasy. And I said, why? And he said, and this are his actual words, he said, only fantasy is mass market these days. All other forms are niche publication. That includes mainstream. Oh, yeah, okay, I get it. And that was certainly the result of Tolkien. He showed the publishers that there was a great demand for fantasy and that it was capable of being satisfied in a mass market sort of way by paperbacks. And of course, that set off, well, you know what happened. It resulted in fantasy becoming the dominant literary mode of the 20th century. I think I started my book Author of the Century, saying that fantasy has been the dominant literary mode of the 20th century. And I can tell they didn't like it. My tutors at Cambridge would have wept, I think, to think that was true. They didn't like that sort of stuff at all because they were fixated on domestic realism, especially when it came to portraits of a lady and things like that. So not interested. Well, so that perhaps explains my interactions with science fiction and Tolkien and medievalism in a way. I wonder why. I think one reason was I was born in India, and English isn't my first language. And I bet you can't guess what is my first language. You've probably never even heard of it. It was Nepali, because my ayah, that's my nanny or my nurse, Blessed Mansoura, she was an Indian Gurkha from Kalimpong in the far northeast of India, just on the border with Nepal. So I actually spoke Nepali with my ayah and nobody else. And then, of course, once I got past the toddler stage, I spoke Hindi, as you guessed, because everybody else spoke Hindi. My mother was a complete bilingual in Hindi because she'd been born in India too. And it was only, as I say, when I was sent off to exile in Scotland that I really became a kind of, when I spoke English all the time, even if it was very heavily accented. And I think that leaves a kind of mark on you. A lot of people don't really believe in foreign languages. They think actually surely they must be able to understand English if I say it slowly. But you know that I knew that wasn't true. I knew it sort of deep in the heart that wasn't true. So I was always okay to have a go at another language. And indeed, I was always interested to have another go at another language. And that's probably why I thought the Anglo-Saxon primer was such a gift. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it even though the texts were, quite boring. Really, they were mostly Bible texts. But that was okay. I just liked the language. See, there's another thing. But however, I may be going on too much. Marco, is there something you would like me to turn my attention to?
No. So far, this has been fantastic. We've been enjoying everything. So we can keep this going as long as you'd like.
There's another thing which is extremely important and which is not recognized by university departments of humanities. I'm getting my snarly voice on again, and I know why. I don't know, it might have been 10 years ago, I was at Kalamazoo, which is the big medieval congress in Michigan. And I was on a panel called Philology, Whence and Whither. Okay. And there were two speakers before me who talked about philology, whence and whither. And then there was me. And of course, they'd overrun. Academics always overrun. So I'd only got about 10 minutes left of allotted time. And I got up and said, we've been talking about philology and we've missed out the most important word. The most important word is comparative. It's not philology that makes the breakthrough. It's comparative philology. That's what changed everything. That was really the Darwinian moment for the humanities. And the person responsible was Jakob Grimm. He realized, well, people had started to realize this already, including, of course, that guy whose name I've forgotten from India, who addressed the Bengal Society in Calcutta and said, we got to realize we all know Latin and Greek, And we all in here speaking Hindi, and many of us have also learned Sanskrit because that is the learned language of India. But isn't it obvious that Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit are all closely related? They've diverged from something. And if you compare them, you can work out what they diverged from. Well, so you can reconstruct completely extinct languages. You can kind of breed them back from their DNA, something like that. So that became a devouring interest for generations of comparative philologists. They did all kinds of things. One of them was, of course, they went around discovering new texts. They were fascinated by new text. It was more information. Pour it in. It's all grist to the mill. And so I would say it really affected the whole study of the humanities. But we've drifted away from it. Nowadays, it is very difficult to get philological training anywhere in the English-speaking world. It's not true elsewhere. If you wanted to learn philology, you should go to Germany or Holland. They still take it seriously, but the English-speaking world has kind of drifted away from it. But Tolkien, of course, he was a real comparative philologist. That was what he specialized in, and it is the source of his inspiration, quite obviously. It was the way he thought. I can only say that Tolkien could find interest and entertainment in the telephone directory because it had got names in it. And if he saw a name, he immediately thought, what is the origin of that? Let's see if I can work it out. I once was firmly put in my place by one of my colleagues whose name was Sturzacker. He was a mathematician. And I said, Sturzacker, that's a German name, isn't it? Sturzacker, it's kind of a high field. He said, no, it is good Old Norse. I said, what are you talking about? You're a mathematician. You don't know Old Norse from old trousers. He said, so what do you think it is? He said, Sturzacker means the field of strife. The field acker, stir is combat. So it's like the dueling ground. And I said, what makes you think that? And he said, Tolkien told me. So that was me put in my place. He got it right. But it's typical that Tolkien, would have been interested just in the guy's name. And I think, as I say, much of the road to Middle-earth is me tracing out where Tolkien got his ideas from or his inspiration from. And there's no doubt it was linguistic history. Not just linguistics, but linguistic history. It's not just the languages now, it's the languages as they were. It's the languages as they were and as they relate to each other. And, he wasn't happy till he had sorted out problems like that. And you can see that in the construction of the various forms of Elvish. You might say just doing Elvish is okay, but no. Got to be a history. Yeah, sorry, Marco?
Yeah. I guess we were wondering if you could elaborate a little more into the specific Old English influences in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Like, clearly there's an influence of Beowulf in The Hobbit, but more into the nitty-gritty, where can we see more similarities?
Yeah. Well, it's obvious that The Hobbit is kind of... the end of The Hobbit is just like the end of Beowulf. Somebody steals a cup, he goes away with it, the dragon gets cross and comes out and starts massacring everybody. It's really Beowulf point for point, you might say. As for Lord of the Rings, well, this is what I think. This is just me. Tolkien was never happy till he'd figured out the kind of philological explanation for things. And there's a problem for him. When he wrote The Hobbit, we got people who appear to be speaking English, but the dwarves all have Old Norse names. How can that come about? Eventually, he decided, I know what, the dwarves have their own language, Kuzdul, but in the far past, they intersected with humans who spoke Old Norse, and they picked up names from them. Now, the hobbits were not far away, and they picked up Old English, which is related to Old Norse. And they then, their form of Old English developed, as ours had, into modern English. Right. So he got that worked out, and that meant that he could actually bring in the riders, who are still speaking Old English. Why are they speaking Old English? Well, because they always did, but they've actually kept it up, whereas the hobbits have kind of moderated it, as we have. So now we've got the Old Norse and the Old English and the hobbits. And actually, at that point, I think Tolkien, who didn't know where the Lord of the Rings was going, realized he could now have the riders, and he could have Gondor, and he could have the whole panorama of Middle-earth expanding, so that it wasn't just a repeat of Bilbo's journey, which up to that point it had been. Frodo had just been following in Bilbo's tracks. But now Tolkien could actually introduce him to a wider world. So that breakthrough, I think, about Old English was very important. Perhaps there's one thing I should say. I've got to run in a couple of minutes. If Tolkien were alive, what question would I ask him? And I'm not sure I'd have the guts to tell the truth. But if I was feeling brave, and after all, we're both old Edwardians, I would say, well, Toller's old chap, I just have one thing I was wondering about. How do you explain the common tongue? I understand how the hobbits speak the language they do, but how come everybody else does? Can you explain that? And I don't think he could, actually. However, you should never underestimate Tolkien. He might have some exceptionally cunning thought, which I hadn't got. But that's the question I would put to him, I think. He only mentions the common tongue twice in The Lord of the Rings. So it's not a subject that comes up much. And of course, the real answer is, when he wrote The Hobbit, he just had people talking English, same as he had people with names in Old Norse. But he'd got to figure out an explanation for this, or he couldn't go on. Well, that's kind of weird, but in fact, I think it's he's the only fantasy author who thinks like that. But that I think is what happened. Well, as I say, I've got to run for yet another of my so-and-so medical appointments. Marco, is there something you would like me to say before I rush?
What's your final thought? Piece of advice to those learning Old English.
I tell you what, I think it's actually sort of vital to integrate your studies. And by that, I mean, don't just stick to poetry, read the prose as well. Don't just stick to literature, look at the history. Don't just look at the history, look at the charters. There's a great deal of information about Old English, but it tends to be, in separate disciplines. And that doesn't help much. There's this little book, that I wrote years ago. And I remember sitting thinking about it, and I made a list of all the topics that people had for Beowulf, Christian and pagan, oral and literate, that sort of thing. I thought, no, this is all kind of boring. And so I started writing sections on drink. What is the attitude to drink? Not entirely unknown, but also not what you find in literary departments. I played rugby for 20 years, mostly for the old Edwardians, as Tolkien did. And so I'm quite familiar with drunken orgies of one kind or another, and indeed with violent outbreaks. If you looked at me closely, you'd see the scars, and some of my best friends carried their scars to their grave. Sorry, got a bit out of hand that day. Yeah. So drink and violence, but also money. What's the interesting thing about money in Beowulf? There isn't any. So what does the word worth mean? Anyway, that's what I wrote about in the little book. And I think that was the way to do it. You had to integrate what we learned about the society, and there's still lots of work there. I think there's still lots of interest there. So read widely. Keep your eyes open for anything which seems worthy of explanation. I've lost a lot of books in my life, and one which I deeply deplore is I lost my copy of Alfrich's Catholic Homilies, which it's 40 homilies written by the Anglo-Saxon Alfrich for different seasons of the year. Now, I'm not at all interested in his theology or anybody's theology, but it was really terrific Old English. Gosh, he was good. He really, you could see that Old English was just as good as modern English. You could use it for exactly the same purposes. And that, I think, was, well, perhaps the most astonishing thing in modern history, and I'm not just saying for the last century, I'm saying for 2,000 years, is that we're all speaking English. Now, at the end of, say, the first century, if you'd gone to the Roman emperor and said, I say, emperor, or if the emperor had said to his wise men, what do you think will be the world language in 2,000 years' time? And all the creeps would have said Latin, boss. And the clever ones would have said Greek. And maybe some very, very well-informed ones would say, well, there's those people very far away to the east, and they speak funny language. I think it's called Chinese. Would anyone have said English? No, because at that time, English was spoken by a small tribe who rated third in a list of 7, and the list of 7 was composed of tribes which the author said had nothing distinctive about them. So they were third in a list of no-hopers, and the only distinctive thing about them was their habit of drowning people in bogs. Yes, that didn't look like a good, gosh, what are the odds if you could have put a bet on, eh? It was 1,000,000 to 1. It was unthinkable, impossible, but that's what happened. Actually, the development of Old English is a great part of the process. So that's keep working on the language, I guess I'd say. The literature is a byproduct, interesting byproduct, but it's the language that's interesting. And I just say two other things. I've got a website called tomshippey.com. Have a look at it. I mean, it's got a list of all my articles and stuff. And there's another one called uppsalabooks.com, which I have some connection with. That one of the books we're going to bring out quite soon is Geoffrey Russam, The Syntax of Beowulf. I think that's very interesting. The syntax of Beowulf. Not the vocabulary, not the semantics, syntax. Yeah, well, I got my own ideas about that, but I should be most interested to read Geoffrey's, and that tells you something about the poetry. The syntax and the poetry are indissoluble. They're the same thing. The poetry has a specialized syntax. Okay, well, like I say, I got to run. If you have questions which I haven't answered, I'm sure you have, email them to me, and I'll answer as many as I can.
Thank you so much.
I mean, it's been a pleasure.
It's been great, and thanks for making the time. Can't wait for a part 2.
Well, it's a pleasure, and my congratulations on your initiative. I think it's a very good idea to have an Old English club.
Bye, Dr.
Bye.
Shippey. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
In the meantime, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. It really helps us reach more people, grow our mission. We're on the road to 100 followers. If you have any questions or remarks, please leave them in the comment section below.
See you soon. But for now, where's Hal?